I think unfortunately, like a few years ago, I felt like this was a unique insight of mine, and most of the large VC firms that were doing Devtools investing were approaching it from this kind of stale enterprise perspective, and that's not true anymore. I think they all figured it out. I'm kind of annoyed, but
Hey everyone, this is Prashant and I'll be your host for the VC 10X podcast. And today we have Lee Edwards with us. Lee is a general partner at Root.vc. Or if you go by his Twitter bio, he's a chill tech investor. And if you listen to the end of this episode, you'll know he's definitely not lying. In this episode, we talk about how he thinks about the DevTools market. How is building DevTools different from building an enterprise SaaS, low code versus no code debate, developer productivity, impact of remote workers on the job market, where's the next GitHub coming from, and a lot more. So without wasting any time, let's dive straight in. Oh wait, if you haven't subscribed to VC10X yet, please do and give us a 5-star rating if you find value in this episode. Now, let's start. Hey Lee, so good to have you on the VC10X podcast. How you doing?
good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm doing good too, and it's my pleasure hosting you. I'm pretty excited to talk about DevTools and all things around that with you and that you're investing in via Root VC. So to start things off, what are the kind of things that you're investing at Root VC and what is your investing thesis over here?
Yeah, so we invest in what we call hard tech. We're interested in kind of hard problems, technical founders, and we're all engineers. We invest in the areas we know. So my background's mainly in software. Chrissy comes from electrical, Emily comes from mechanical, Kane is kind of hard industry, and Avidan's embedded systems, to say the short version of it. Yeah, I've been doing a lot in developer tools, software infrastructure. I define that really broadly, just anything that people are using to build software, anything software engineers are using, and also really interested in certain kinds of vertical applications of AI. So we recently invested in Adept, which you may have seen out there, a large language model company.
Yeah, absolutely. I see you talking about DevTools a lot around Twitter, and I've been following you on Twitter. So anyone who's interested in this space should definitely give uh, Lee a follow. I'll make sure to put his handle link in the show notes below. So yeah, that's great. That's awesome. The things that you're investing in. Now let's talk about what are the kind of things that you're looking for in a company that you're planning to invest in.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard thing to answer in generic terms without kind of like I don't know, giving answers to study for the test or something, but or just being too generic. But I think it comes down to is there a huge opportunity here? Are the founders the right people to solve it? Um, and I think that there's kind of a lot to that, right? Is now the right time to do it? Is the team capable of executing on the vision? And do I agree with how you view the world? I think it's like one thing. A lot of times, my diligence comes down to is like, all right, you have all these ideas and claims. Like, do I see things the same way? If I kind of think about it myself, um, and I like to do a lot of like potential customer diligence. Is like kind of one of my tools. I do instead of like talking to existing customers, which I think runs the risk of fatiguing your customers. And also, we invest a lot of times. I don't know, maybe half the companies we're investing in don't have customers yet. So I like to talk to people that are potential customers and just be like, do you have this problem? Like, is this problem worth spending money on? What are the gaps? Like, what are you using to solve this problem? And what are the gaps? And then the other thing I do a lot is writing. So I'll kind of like write a deal memo and see if I can talk myself into doing the investment or not.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, are you like basically writing a memo to pitch your partners? Is that what you're planning to do? You're intending to do with that, or is it just to convince yourself that if it's on paper, that am I convinced while reading it that this is an investable company?
Yeah, it's funny. Deal memos in most firms are really more of that. They're more convincing the partners. But I think like a lot of firms that are our size, there's four of us. We actually make decisions independently. There isn't really like a voting on new deals coming in. There's other stuff we sort of vote on, but I think there's a conventional wisdom that sometimes the best investments out of a venture fund are controversial and contrarian, and there's dissenting opinion, and also because we all have different expertise, right? I think actually all of us are a little bit interdisciplinary. Like I speak a little bit of mechanical engineering, and Chrissy speaks manufacturing and electrical engineering, and Kane has a computer science degree, even though he kind of does industrial. So we do kind of speak each other's languages a bit, but we ultimately, I think, kind of trust the person. So the reason I do the writing is more writing forces you to structure your thinking, right? I know I've always enjoyed writing. And I don't know if you see me on Twitter, you can see I probably write hundreds of words a day of stupid tweets. But yeah, I think
That's
it's a
true.
really
Yeah.
you can't think if you can't like if you can write something, you've I think been able to think about it, at least when you're talking about an essay form. Like maybe in tweets you don't have to think that much to tweet, but
Mhm.
um,
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome, and I totally vouch for writing. And as a, it's not just like in the investing aspect, but like it helps you clarify your thinking in whatever you're trying to do, basically. Because I myself being a writer, I write every day, and I've been writing every day on my personal blog for more than 1,500 days now. So I know how it has clarified my thinking over time and helped me structure my thoughts. So that's definitely something that everyone can do, and not just investors, but it helps you make better decisions overall, right?
yeah, for
Besides
sure.
yeah, talking about contrarianism in the investing space, and like everyone is trying to back the contrarians, right? So while you are looking at investments, are you looking to spot the contrarians, like who is doing the contrary thing, going against the norm, and then trying to back them? If yes, then are there some examples of companies that you backed previously that can fall into that category of contrarians?
Yeah, it's funny. I wouldn't. Yeah, I'm not even sure I would necessarily frame it that way. I mean, I think a lot of times you are someone that has a unique insight, so maybe it's something other people haven't realized, or um, most people don't agree with. But I wouldn't say that it's sort of something I'm like specifically on the lookout for. It is exciting when it happens, when I realize like, oh, this person believes a really uncommon thing, and I actually happen to also agree. But I really think it's the future. So yeah, one example of that is a company called Zed, which is Nathan Sobo and Max, his co-founders Max and Antonio. They all came from GitHub together. They worked on GitHub Atom and Electron, um, and Max was the original author of Tree Sitter, which is the first or the most popular open source AST builder. Um, and Antonio's worked on a lot of like CRDT, like uh, backend data type things. So they're actually building a code editor. And in like my deal memo, in the I think like the very first, I open source these things. So whenever their next round of funding happens and is announced, uh, that's usually when I publish it. So um, I think the memo started with something like, in some ways, this is the worst market you can imagine. The largest, there is a whale that's backed by a major tech company that's over half the market and it's free. And then there's also an infinite long tail of other like small competitors, startups, and open source projects. And some people have been using their editor for 30 years and are never going to change it. People have like deep brand affinity and loyalty, and will like fight wars over like which editor they're using. So it's like literally the worst market. um,
Yeah.
but I think there's a few reasons it's interesting, which I don't know. We don't necessarily. I guess we can touch them a little bit, but I think the VS Code kind of proved that you can actually go from zero to majority in 6 years, um, if you make a good enough product. And obviously, Microsoft has a super cheat code for distribution, but uh, the I think their unique insights are mostly around product design, and how does a text editor become a collaboration tool, and a point of collaboration. Like why am I making a commit and pushing it so that you can read it and asynchronously give me feedback? Um, the commit should be like a deploy artifact. It's a release artifact. Shouldn't if you and I are working in the same office together and writing code, usually what happens is I might ask you a question and maybe like point at the screen and be like, how does that work? Or, hey, I started writing this. What do you think? Or maybe we even pair program or do something that's similar to pair programming. I think people do that a lot. And we've kind of lost that in the remote world. So anyway, so I think it's really funny. A lot of I think when I talk to other investors about this company, usually in the first 5 seconds, I kind of see their eyes be like, "You're an idiot," and then by the time I'm done talking about it, they're like, "Oh, that's actually really cool."
Yeah, yeah. That's typical contrarian investment. All right, like since you have a lot of insights on DevTools and you're deep into the space, so what's the difference in your opinion in a developer tool and a company that's building developer tool versus enterprise software? Right? What's the difference in how you build these products and how you build that company?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of different developer tools out there, but I think there's a big category of developer tools whose go-to-market doesn't really look like enterprise at all, right? It looks more like consumer adoption, really. This isn't like really new. I think people have talked about the consumerization of enterprise, the sort of like wave of SaaS companies that are sort of like, okay, people at work demand these sort of better user experiences. That was kind of like a buzzword in VC like 10 years ago. Um, and then I think people have also talked about shadow IT for like 20, 30 years. But I think this phenomenon goes a little bit beyond that. It's a little more than like, oh, my existing tool is annoying. I'm like going to bring this thing in because it solves my problem, is sort of the shadow IT pattern. A lot of developer tools are more like, I use this at home. I love it. There's a community. I went to the meetup. My friend is using it. I've read all these blog posts about it. I can't live without it. I need to bring it. I actually love it. I have affinity for it. And that's a consumer kind of behavior. Um, every DevTools company eventually does bring in an enterprise practice. Like, I mean, I think the most extreme example of like GitHub waiting quite a long time to do that, um, and then others do it very early. Right? Like Snowflake did it from day one. So, like I said, there's lots of different kinds of companies, but ultimately, yeah, I think you do have enterprise sales motions, but I think it's wrong to kind of look at the seed stage of a developer tool and try to think about it from an enterprise lens. I think you have to think about the potential of like, is this something people will pay for in the future? And there's a lot of like components to that question. So there's been plenty of very popular open source projects that tried to charge money and couldn't. Um, or maybe you end up being able to charge money, but only in a way you didn't want to. Like maybe it was consulting services, and that sometimes that works, but I think many times it doesn't. Especially if it's the primary means of monetization, it usually doesn't work. So yeah, I think it ends up being different. I think unfortunately, like a few years ago, I felt like this was a unique insight of mine, and most of the large VC firms that were doing DevTools investing were approaching it from this kind of stale enterprise perspective, and that's not true anymore. I think they all figured it out. I'm kind of annoyed, but but I think at least as someone, I use these products like I have, and actually every day I use that every day. I write a little bit of code every day, so um, I at least have some like empathy for this.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think some of the firms I used to think about as like, oh, those folks aren't going to get it. Like, look at who's investing on the team, and then I'm like, I see who they hired, and I'm like, holy shit. You hired like a really impressive person out of a really impressive startup who's an engineer. Anyway, so I think everyone's figuring this out.
Right, absolutely. And I see that you have some strong views on the low code versus no code debate, because right now we have a lot of no code tools coming in the market. And and I saw a tweet by you which said that low code is infinitely better than no code. So can you
Yeah,
throw some light on that?
yeah. I think, and I'm not. It's funny. I wouldn't want to rule out no code. I think if someone has interesting no code ideas, they should definitely talk to me about it. But I think that we underestimate code and low code. Because I think the number of people that write code or that are capable, if they had to, or if they wanted to, or if it were easier, I think is very high. I would consider, you know, copy pasting copy pasting Excel formulas that you don't understand from Stack Overflow is still writing code. I think like writing SQL is writing code. Um, Even doing like Markdown is writing code. So I think basically everyone's capable of some kind of code. And the thing is, it's just very powerful. Um, there are certain things that are more specifically and more directly specified by writing code. So I'm actually a lot more interested in. how do more and more people become developers? I'm going to use that word as broadly as possible, right? Can you teach people, are people like writing a little bit more SQL? Are they using a DSL? Are they like, putting markdown into text box? Like that's going to give them superpowers over their job of kind of manually doing things. Um, I always think that's interesting. I'm always looking for areas where you're like, wow, you have to be a really good programmer to do this. And is there a way for it to get easier and easier? I think machine learning is a prime example of this, where it's kind of moved from this like these godlike powers to PyTorch is kind of like Prometheus of this space. Like we're kind of like brought the fire down to the mortals, and but it's still not that easy. Like I still think there's a long way to go. And on the other hand, when it comes to no code things, like do I believe? I guess this is the other piece of this is like, do I believe the way that you give um, models to everyone is to make it so they can like drag and drop images into web browsers? I don't know if that goes. I don't know if that's the most exciting thing to me. Because I think a lot of times the hard part is always like identifying the problem, kind of breaking the problem down, solving the components, like thinking like an engineer, being like a shape rotator about this stuff, like is kind of the hard part. Writing code, like anyone can write code. Like it's seriously, you're writing instructions for something where there's a will, there's a way. Not everyone has the patience to write like 1,000 line thing, but people would have the patience to copy paste um, a line of code into a web page if they needed to. So I tend to think it's less about the interface and it's more about the domain modeling and concepts. I think in the machine learning space, that's the biggest thing. If you explain to someone like how should I use stable diffusion for this, right? There's kind of a lot you um, would have to explain if you want them to go a little bit deeper. Um, yeah. On the other hand, I mean, there are lots of drag and drop tools specifically for that. So I don't know. I think there's opportunity in both. I just think that the more people can write code is a little bit overlooked.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, that's true. Makes sense. Besides, let's talk about developer productivity. There was a tweet that said that any tools that can improve developer productivity, because there is a lack of developers in the market right now. So any tools that can improve developer productivity are great right now, right? So can you throw some more light on that?
Yeah, and I think it's only become increasingly true since I said that. In There's a couple things, right? I mean, developers bringing their own tools to work, right? And they're making decisions about these things. At at most companies, within reason, the CFO is kind of like, oh my God, why are we paying for this Slack thing? It's like $7 a month. Like this is just adding a lot of overhead, right? And like they very quickly get shut down. That conversation probably won't make it out of the first room it happens in. If someone explains to them about what the engineers need this thing for, and how much you pay the engineers and how much the tool costs. Then the boundaries of this end up being like cloud compute, right? Like there are people spending 5x their salary on GPUs for little ROI. That I think that's actually a reckoning that's coming. But for most things, for tools, for productivity tools, um, yeah, it's a no brainer, right? And that's even like um, even things like Stripe. Like there are companies, you hear about this a lot, where the CFO is like, "Oh, I did research on Braintree, and we can actually like save a little bit of more money over Stripe." And the developers are like, "We're literally going to quit." So yeah, so I think that dynamic is there, and then the company is incentivized to do this, like especially in a market that's hard to hire in. If there's an economic downturn, we're kind of focusing on core parts of the business. We're focusing on unit economics. We're cutting costs. Productivity, like headcount is being frozen. Productivity is the thing you want, right? Like you look at product. Look at things like Heroku or like platform as a service or um, things that are basically their pitch is we replace the DevOps engineer. And there's a lot of stuff out there that's like, we replace your security engineer, or we count ourselves as like a head count in this department. That kind of stuff is very appealing. Um, and yeah, I think I'd love to see the data on this. My anecdotal observation is I don't think companies are really cutting serious developer tools from their budgets as they're going through this stuff. I think now is a difficult time to be in a pretty optional. This is a classic thing in economic downturns, like HR SaaS software tends to be the first to go, or anything that's sort of viewed as like not directly in the line of business. And HR professionals hate this, as you know, as well they should. Their stuff tends to be first on the chopping block. But I don't. So far, I don't think I've really seen this on the developer tool side. So.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Besides, like with remote work becoming a lot more common now, and remote developers coming in to the scene. So now basically a company in the United States, Silicon Valley, can now hire developers from maybe India, right? So how does that impact the entire dynamic of this thing and the developer market?
Yeah, I mean, I think this trend has existed for a while, really. But I don't know. I guess one of my contrarian points of view is I do think that co-location of teams, like regardless of where the team is, has a lot of benefits. That being said, I think almost every company I work with has some employees that are remote, and some of them are fully remote. But yeah, if it were me starting a company today, and I possibly could, no matter where I lived, I would try to make sure like, okay, all the co-founders are in the same place. We see each other a lot. We get a lot of face time, and because the work is creative, and you kind of like want that serendipity. It's a long, long time before a startup is at the point where they're like, okay, we wrote a spec, we threw it over the wall. Someone's going to bang out the code. Someone's going to do the QA. We can ship it. So I think I think the trend has existed. I think the trend is good in a lot of ways. Yeah, but I do think it'll continue. I think you have a lot more credible options of places you can live, and the tooling is supporting it more and more. I think it's not even close to perfect, not even close. Um,
Right.
but yeah, and also, so the other thing is for developer tools companies, right? This conversation is very different if my other partners are in the room. I really don't think you can do a hardware company remotely. I'm not the expert on this, but Chrissy and Emily are, and they would agree. SpaceX and Tesla are mostly co-located when it comes to design engineering. Apple is the three places that the two of them worked. So yeah, that's a thing that gets missed a lot in these conversations. So like this is funny when you see, if I don't know, for those who are like kind of eternally online for like VC and tech Twitter, like one thing that you see when people are arguing and talking past each other is like look at what they're saying when Elon's talking about things being in person. Like, what is Elon thinking about all day? He's thinking about SpaceX and Tesla. You're not building a rocket with a remote team. And then you see people are like, oh, this is stupid, this is crazy. At GitLab we're all remote. I'm like, yeah, like that works really well for you. You have a Git workflow at the company that's building the Git workflow company. Like it literally it works. I'm sure a lot of the Zoom team is remote. I'm sure a lot of the Slack team is remote. And open source project. I mean, the Linux kernel was built by people who barely saw each other. Like it's well established patterns and tools.
Right. Like that totally makes sense. Like it really depends on what you're trying to build. And if it's a hardware product, then it's really hard to, embrace remote work in that case. But if it's a software product that doesn't require a lot of co-location and working together, then maybe you can consider remote work. All right. Besides, uh, what's your opinion on where is the next GitHub coming from in terms of collaboration, on how
Hmm,
developers collaborate and how it impacted how developers operate in general? So, where do you
hmm,
think that product is coming from next?
totally. Yeah, I never intend to go on interviews just like pumping my own companies because I think it's kind of annoying as a listener. So I'll try not to do it. I did mention one of our companies that's working on this, and there's a few that are also doing it. But yeah, I mean, I think the overall thing, I think it's kind of weird that so GitHub's original tagline was social coding, right? And I think I had used SVN and CVS before Git came out, and I never used Git until GitHub came out. So I think those two things are like close to synonymous at this point. When like actually, I guess GitLab people would be super angry to hear me say that. But like yes, I mean I'd put GitLab in the same category. The pull request concept is essentially like part of Git, even though it literally isn't. Um, so like that workflow, it was just dramatically better than CVS and SVN, where I'm like locking a file, and then yeah, I like fall asleep at my keyboard, and then get up late, and then the next person in the morning is like, oh, Lee has that file locked, like this horrible way to write software. It is, by the way, the state of the art for mechanical CAD. That is literally how mechanical CAD gets done. They call it PLM, product lifecycle management, and these horrible products do this to these poor people. But in any case, yeah, so I think it just watching that time compress, like teams really rely on Slack to sort of have chat it's both synchronous and asynchronous. It's probably most of the time asynchronous, but then it kind of like in the limit case, it becomes synchronous. But still, if I want you to look at my code, like I'm typically making a branch, I'm making a commit, I'm showing it to you. And like making a commit is, I don't know, for different people, it probably feels a little different, but on some level for everyone, you're sort of packaging your work up and saying like, this is something like worth reviewing, right? It's like, whether you're doing this as like showing this to someone or like testing it on staging or you're making a PR, it's almost like a political act, or it's definitely like a personal act that puts your ass on the line, and to varying degrees. But yeah, I think one of the questions is just like why is the commit the canonical unit of collaboration when it's actually very discrete? And a commit can contain one line of code and 30 seconds of work. It can also contain a week of work and hundreds of lines of code. And the funny thing, I think kind of the proof of this is that we all know the best practice is like more and more smaller and smaller commits. Like we know that the limit should approach zero. And so, yeah, I think at the same time, like enabling asynchronous work is one reason that programming works remotely, but we do lose something by being all asynchronous. I think there are times when synchronous adds a ton of value. So I think that's one of the frontiers for collaboration. And yeah, I will plug our companies. So I mentioned Zed. Daily is one of our companies. It's a API for video chat using WebRTC. So they're like bringing that to a lot of different tools. And Octeto is a company that kind of lets your development environment exist remotely in the cloud. And so there's many use cases for that, but one of them is this, the idea of like, if I want to run my thing in the cloud, like most people are testing their code at certain companies, like certain companies I've been at that shall remain nameless. People test their code by pushing it to staging and letting CI run the tests. And you're like, all right, is that really like the best way to be doing this?
Got it. Yeah. You finally gave in to the temptation of
I had to, because I'm so excited about this stuff. I legitimately love this stuff. I'm very excited about it. And when I talk about it, I'm like, yeah, there's these smart people working on this thing.
Right.
And I don't know. It's also self-serving, but I don't know. You can probably tell I legitimately love it.
No, that's good. That's totally that's worth it, right? If they're doing good work, like they're worth every mention they get, right? And I'll make sure to put the links in the show notes and also the blog post that'll go along with this episode, so people can check them out as well. Besides, what is that change that you still wish to see in the Devtools ecosystem?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's funny because it's sort of like if I knew exactly what it was, I'd probably build it, I guess. I think that there's a lot of I think there's like a few things I always find myself gravitating towards. There's this perennial, it's existed forever, this sort of trade-off of like performance and productivity. Where I think even like going from like writing assembly to writing C, like every time, most of the time when you add an abstraction, you are making a trade-off of some kind. And often it's like performance and usability, like really, really good examples of that. Yeah, it's funny. It shows us how far we've come that like Java is a really good example here, where like you're like, oh my God, Java is so non-performant compared to C++, at the time in the 90s. Now Java is like quite performant, but you're trading off like direct memory management for developer productivity and happiness. And then I think taken to extreme, like Ruby kind of claims to be a language, and Rails claims to be a framework that's designed for developer happiness. But now we're seeing things like Rust that kind of shift this curve. Like I think Rust is still extremely hard. It's harder than one probably two of those languages I mentioned, but it's easier than the other two I mentioned. and highly performant, and also does a really good job at a certain kind of performance, multi-threading, thread safety, multi-core, that lots of other languages that are performant aren't even good at. So I think it's interesting to see that anytime, like, and to I guess now to take the leap to like startups, like um, things I bring up every time I talk about developer tools in like a very high level. I always end up talking about Heroku, which again, a lot of investors are kind of like, why? Because it was sort of like for an investor, it was like a middling exit. This is like kind of a really offensive thing to say to people that spend a lot of time and hard work on Heroku, and a lot of them, did pretty well financially with it. But for an investor, you're not looking for you want like $1 billion plus exit. But I think Heroku, I'm stealing this line from, I don't know if I should name them necessarily, but an executive from Heroku who said basically like Heroku created a lot more value than it captured. That's basically right. So it's impossible for me to talk about Devtools without talking about Heroku. For me, I love that company. I still love that company. I wear their swag, and they were a really good example of this, right? I mean, you're paying extra money for productivity, for them to kind of like implement this architecture for you, and not have to think about it, and way more expensive than just using AWS. But what you're paying for is the developer productivity. And the more apps you have, like the more developers you have, the more you kind of realize the value of that. So, but yeah, it's interesting to see as things evolve. I've seen some like next generation platform as a service companies that I think are changing the trade-off curve by letting you kind of dig in if you want to like get under the hood of the platform. Um, and Yeah, so I think I don't know. That's just one rant of like many. I guess I really heavily weight developer productivity when I look at something. I think historically that has sometimes meant throwing performance completely out the window. It's exciting to see that yeah, maybe you can have a little bit of both. I'm optimistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Now I'll have the last main question before I move on to the quick rapid fire round. So this one is about how do you add value to your portfolio companies? So if you can quickly give me like 4 to 5 things that you help your portfolio companies with, that'd be great.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I do is I try not to subtract value. So that puts me hopefully in the top 50%. Yeah, I mean, the number one thing when founders ask me that is if I'm giving them a term sheet and hoping to close them, I have them ask the founders I work with, which I think they'll all have, like, not only hopefully they'll all give me a thumbs up, but they'll all have different stories. And I think that's kind of the point is I think sort of generic one size fits all VC advice can be very, very value subtractive. I think one reason you see it on the internet is you're literally like the content you're writing as a VC is like the audience is for everyone. So it is pretty generic. But if you get in the boardroom with an investor and they're kind of like repeating something you could have read in a blog post, I think that's not helpful. Um, so I think it's pretty clear talking to me. Like I'm someone who kind of thinks like an engineer. I think about problem solving in a very technical way, in a way that annoys my fiance sometimes, annoys a lot of people in my life. But like I think that what you're usually doing to help is like being someone to kind of bounce ideas off of, be a first principles thinker with, like be a collaborator, and maybe someone to kind of like agitate the stable equilibrium. Like you and your co-founders have been talking about this idea, and you've probably, kind of yeah, you've found an equilibrium, and that sometimes that's a really, really good thing, right? But sometimes you kind of want someone from the outside to come in and sort of challenge it, and discover if it's a stable or unstable equilibrium. So I mean, having been on the other side of the table, having been the CTO at a startup that uh, CTO at one startup where we were high flying, like front page news, like big deal, and then we were crash and burn and pain and existential crisis. Like I've sort of seen that up and down, and worked with a lot of really amazing investors and board members through all that I kind of model after a little bit, or try to. And I think having that empathy and understanding what the role of the investor is. Like, we're not in control, we're not even managing, it's influencing. And I kind of lived that, moving from engineer to engineering manager to executive. You are losing more and more direct control and having to get comfort with, like, you're attempting to influence. And so I think a lot of people get that wrong. A lot of managers get that wrong, right? Like, I got that wrong at first. I think almost every good manager has fucked that up at some point in their lives. And there's kind of a more extreme version of that if you're a board member, whether that's as an investor or a founder or an executive or outside board member. It's At the end of the day, like, sometimes doing the thing to do to help is to not do anything and let the founder be themselves. Like, you invested in them for a reason. Um, so
Yep.
I don't know. It's kind of a lame answer. If you wanted to get concrete, a lot of
Right.
times the way these things go is like, I mean, helping the company raise the next round of funding. It's like a big part of
Right.
my job to know how the ecosystem looks like, to be connected to those people.
Hmm.
Connections to for hiring. I think probably most of our companies have at least one person that we've brought in. Some companies I work
Nice.
with have like 3 or more people we brought in.
Hmm.
Um, uh, and yeah, connections for sales. Um, but I think all I mean, that's everyone's answer. I think some of the larger firms have a platform, which really just means they've productized and outsourced this. So instead of
Right.
the partner you're working with helping you with recruiting, they send you to the recruiter. So we're
Right.
kind of a do things that doesn't scale kind of firm, and you sort of get
Hmm.
us, not
Right.
a back office. Um,
Right.
so
Yeah, I
yeah,
think that's awesome. Like that's a great value add, starting from bottom to the very top. Like helping them with the product and being someone who's been in the shoes before and helping them do that. Besides also having the like in general value add, which most VC firms offer, like hiring and stuff like that, raising the next round, right? That's a great all in all well rounded off answer to the value add question. Besides, now let's make things exciting. Rapid fire round. So 5 quick questions about the fund, and you have to give 5 quick answers about all of these. Are we good?
let's do it.
All right. First one: sectors and regions you invest in.
Developer tools, AI, and all regions.
Great. What stage you typically invest in?
Pre-seed, seed, post-seed, anything with seed.
Okay. What's the
Mhm.
typical check size?
2 to 3 million in this fund.
Okay. Where can the founders apply?
Root.vc. So if you can use a command line interface, you can find the info.
I love the website, by the way. Last one. Where can our listeners follow you?
TERRONK on Twitter, um,
Okay.
or just search for me, Lee Edwards. But yeah, be prepared for a wild ride. It's not all Devtools. It's usually just whatever I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. It's worth it, right? It's worth the while. All right. So I'll make sure to plug all those links in the show notes below. It was great talking to you. Loved all the insights you shared on the Devtools ecosystem in general. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming on, and happy investing.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.